we going to somehow tie the message series in Mark to Mother's Day, or are we going to go somewhere else for the week? That's an interesting question, probably a good question. The short answer to the question is neither. We are going to tie Mother's Day into our series, but we are going to go some other places this week, because this message is entitled Mark's Mama. Some of you may be familiar with the story of the life of John Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark. Some of you may have heard bits and pieces, and some of you may not be familiar at all with the story of the life of John Mark. So this could be new for many of us. But what we do have with John Mark is a very special testimony of how important in the formative years of a person's life a godly home with godly parents can be. In our text in Mark chapter 14 last week, we actually got a hint about his family when we looked at chapter 14, verses 13 through 16. Remember this? And he, Jesus, sendeth forth two of his disciples, and saith unto them, Go ye into the city, and there shall meet you a man bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him. I mentioned last week that John Mark doesn't tell us who these two disciples were, and for all we knew, it could have been any two. But actually, today, I'm going to reveal their names to you. Mark chapter 14, verse 14 goes on to say, And wheresoever he shall go in, say you to the goodman of the house, the master saith, Where is the guest chamber, where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? It's interesting. This word guest chamber, katalum, is only used 3 times in the New Testament. Once in Luke chapter 2. How many of you remember the famous story of the innkeeper who turned Jesus away? Problem is, the Bible never mentions an innkeeper, does it? It never actually mentions anything more than there was no room for them in the inn, right? Katalum or kataluma could have actually different shades of meaning depending on context. Essentially, it meant a temporary lodging. In this case, it means the guest chamber of a big house. Usually, the top floor, the second or third floor of the house was reserved as the special guest chamber. In the case of Luke chapter 2, it probably referred to the fact that among the relatives of Joseph, whose family was from Bethlehem, when Joseph and Mary and Jesus, of course, was born after they arrived, but when they came down from Nazareth in Galilee, they likely would have stayed with Joseph's relatives, except all the guest chambers were filled. And so this could either refer to the public camping area where many of the people who were coming for the time of Hanukkah, which is when Jesus was most likely born, probably that's where they were talking about. But it's also possible they were simply referring to there was not enough room in the guest chamber, so they slept on the bottom floor of the house, where there would generally be, in a commoner's house, somebody who wasn't super wealthy, a feeding trough or a manger that you could bring the animals in when it's cold outside and feed them with. So this word can mean many things. What's fascinating to me about it is that he said, Say ye to the goodman of the house, the master saith, Where is the guest chamber? The goodman of the house actually is a word that comes from the idea of the overlord of the house in Greek. Literally, the root word actually is the word husband, which is interesting because this is the only reference we have here in Mark and in Luke when it tells the same story to John Mark's father. We don't even know his name. The family name is not Mark. Mark is a Greek name, and Marcus, or Mark, was the name that was given to John, which was his Hebrew name, because this was apparently a very wealthy family and likely Roman citizens, but because they had great dealings with Romans and other nations within the empire, as was common, they had both a Hebrew name, in his case, Jonas, or John, and Marcus, or Mark. The only thing we know about his dad is that Jesus said, if you tell him to show you where the guest chamber is, everything will be fine. And what does this tell us about John Mark's parents? And I'm going to explain to you why I know this is John Mark's family later. What does it tell us about John Mark's family that when they arrived and said their message, what they found was a room that was already prepared for them? It wasn't like they had to say, well, we want to go to the guest chamber and we'll bring all the provisions. No, and he will show you a large upper room, furnished and prepared, there make ready for us. Furnished. There would have been a table that would have been about the size of this platform off the ground. It would not have had chairs around it, as in Da Vinci's portrayal in his painting The Last Supper, because that's a Western idea. It would have had couches, and they would have laid back as they were eating, because that's how they did it in the ancient Middle East and most of the Eastern world. They would have found the place all set up for the supper, and they would have even found it prepared. Most of what they needed was already there. The only thing they would have needed to bring was the lamb itself. Verse 16, and his disciples went forth and came into the city and found as he said unto them, and they made ready the Passover. Okay? Luke 22 tells the story this way. Then came the first day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. And Jesus sent Peter and John, the two unnamed disciples from Mark, now have names. Simon Peter and John, the son of Zebedee, saying, go and prepare the Passover for us, so that we may eat it. They said to him, where do you want us to prepare it? And he said unto them, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house that he enters. And you shall say to the owner of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large, furnished upper room. Prepare it there. And they left and found everything just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. And when they were coming to they went up into an upper room. Acts chapter 1, verse 13. We're going to start putting the pieces together about this upper room. And when they were come in, they went up into an upper room, where abode both Peter and James and John and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon Zelotes, and Judas the brother of James. If you counted while I was reading, that's 11 apostles. Judas, of course, has already committed suicide. Acts chapter 1:13 is immediately after the ascension of Christ. So we've gone from Passover, when Jesus died, the first day of unleavened bread, when Jesus was placed in the tomb, through the 7-day feast, during which on Sunday Jesus rose from the dead. We've now gone 7 weeks from that Sabbath to a 7th Sabbath, 49 days, and the following day is Sunday. It's the Feast of Pentecost. And as we are coming to the story of the Feast of Pentecost, we find the 11 apostles are still in the upper room. They were staying with John Mark's family. They were essentially residents. Very early Christian tradition tells us that they had never moved elsewhere. From the night of Passover, the night Jesus was arrested, the 11 apostles continued to make their lodging in Jerusalem in this place. Which is really interesting because at the crucifixion of Jesus, Jesus handed the care of his own mother, Mary, to John, the son of Zebedee, John the beloved. And John, it says, took Mary to his own house, which is odd that John, at that point, already owned a house in Jerusalem. But he wasn't staying there. The apostles were all camped out at John Mark's house. In Acts chapter 12, verse 12, now understand, from Acts 1 to Acts 12, we've now jumped 12 years in history, at least. And Herod is persecuting Christians. And he arrests Simon Peter and kills James, the brother of John. And he woke up outside the prison after what he thought was a dream of an angel leading him out, Simon Peter. And Simon Peter, it says, and when he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. And this is the first time in the New Testament that her name is given. So far, we've seen her hosting the apostles for Passover with Jesus, allowing the apostles to stay in her home, and now, approximately 12 to 15 years later, it's no longer her husband's house. Think about that for a moment. When Jesus talked about the house, he said, go find the goodman of the house. There was a husband there. Now it's the house of Mary. What does that imply? Her husband is dead. Now she's a widower, but when Simon Peter came to and he was looking for a safe place to get to, where did he go? He went to the house of Mary. He went to John Mark's home because Simon Peter knew that this had been a safe place since the night Jesus died. That's interesting. Colossians chapter 4, verse 10 tells us something else about this woman. She was connected to another famous messenger of Jesus, famous preacher in the first century. Colossians 4:10, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you, and Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas. John Mark's related to Barnabas. And it says, touching whom, that is John Mark, ye received commandments, if he comes unto you, receive him. It's interesting, this term, this Greek term, translated sister's son. We would naturally kind of assume from an American perspective that means that John Mark is Barnabas's nephew, which is very possible. But actually the term can be broader than that. It actually means not brood, B-R-O-O-D, not from the same brood. In other words, not the same parents. But it's a term of family relationship other than brother or sister. Some people think they were cousins. Some people think that it's literally he was the uncle of John Mark. I don't know that it much matters, but it's interesting that Barnabas was also a person who had been influenced by Mary and her husband. Now, I went through all of that very fast to give you just the scriptures. Now let's put some pieces together and see what we can learn about this incredible woman, Mary, Mark's mama. There are up to 7 different women named Mary in the New Testament. How many of you knew that? Everybody who was here last week should be raising their hand. up to 7 different women named Mary in the New Testament. Who's the one everybody remembers? Jesus' mother. Who's the second most famous? Mary Magdalene. Maybe people remember Mary of Bethany, Martha and Lazarus' sister, right? The story of Mary and Martha is very familiar. The story of Mary of Bethany washing the feet of Jesus is very familiar to people who've spent any time in church. But this woman, whose name is only mentioned once, is famous for 3 things. One is her house. Her house comes up a lot. In fact, there's actually a monastery in the Holy Land that had been built where supposedly Mary's house was, and there was this placard that said, "And this is the place where the house of Mary stood." Probably not real, just to be blunt. But, they probably just said, "This is the most likely spot," and called it, and everybody believed it. But it doesn't really matter. It's just interesting how from that point until now, we're still talking about Mary's house. But we never call it that. Isn't that interesting? We know that John Mark grew up there. We know that John Mark's father was probably alive when Jesus died, but was dead by the time that Simon Peter ran there for safety. We know the household had at least one servant because she's the one who said, "Hey, you guys are praying for Peter? He's at the gate." And everybody went, "Girl, we're having a prayer meeting because Peter's in prison. We're praying for God to get him out of jail. Obviously, he's not at the gate." So Simon Peter got louder and louder until somebody said, I think there is somebody at the gate. Hopefully it's not guards, right? Hopefully it's not it's not the Roman guards coming to arrest all of us. They go out and they find Simon Peter. Mary's house. She's also famous for being the sister, perhaps, or maybe aunt of Barnabas. Barnabas. This is an interesting guy. The Bible tells us that before he was sent as an apostle of the churches, what we today would call a missionary, to go and preach the gospel in other places, he had great possessions and great lands, and he sold all of his lands so he could share with the rest of the church who were impoverished. Because Christians very early were being persecuted and kicked out of the synagogue, and if you weren't part of the synagogue, you couldn't do business, and so they were losing their incomes. By getting saved and getting baptized and becoming part of the first church in Jerusalem, they were sacrificing everything. And Barnabas said, "Well, I'm rich enough," sold everything he had and made sure that all of the church members, remember, very quickly they were numbering between 12 and 15,000. And Barnabas made sure they were all fed. What happened when he ran out of money? I don't know. I know that a few years later, Barnabas and Paul were taking up a collection from the churches all over the world. And all that time, the house of Barnabas' family, Mary's house, was a center, a refuge for the church in Jerusalem, for the followers of Jesus. We also know this. She's famous for her house. She's famous for her relationship, whatever it was, to Barnabas. But she's also famous for being John Mark's mother. I think it might be fascinating to be able to say, "Hi, I'm Mrs. Dickens, and my son wrote A Christmas Carol. You ever heard of Ebenezer Scrooge? My kid made him up," right? Or, "Hi, I'm Mrs. Shakespeare. Maybe you've heard of my son Will. He writes plays and poems and stuff." Maybe someday he'll get a real job. Imagine if you could say, my name is Mrs. Lamore. Have you heard of my son Louis? Right? Or to be able to say that you were the mother of Scheherazade. 1001 Arabian Nights. But John Mark's mother could say, hi, my son is John Mark. That was a great sermon today, Pastor. Did you know my son wrote that book? Her son was probably there the night Jesus was arrested in the garden. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. He was very young. It's likely that what happened was the soldiers came to the house of Mary and her husband looking for Jesus. Because they wouldn't have known necessarily that he was gone to the garden, right? Judas betrayed where they were staying. Judas and the guard show up at the house. Jesus and the apostles are not there. So Judas says, they've gone to the garden. I know where they are. They're in Gethsemane. I know the spot. I'll take you there. John Mark probably got out of bed, heard the commotion at the door, realized what was going on, threw on his linen tunic, hastily threw something on, didn't fully get dressed, and ran as fast as he could to the Garden of Gethsemane. And there at Gethsemane, he came to warn the apostles, but the guards got there too. And the Gospel of Mark alone records this incident. As the disciples were fleeing from Jesus, there was a young man there, unnamed, who a guard reached out to catch him by the garment, and he simply slipped out of his overcoat, his linen garment, and ran away naked. Early Christian tradition tells us John Mark was talking about himself. That wasn't the last time that he turned and ran home. Several years later, over a decade, the Apostle Paul and his uncle or cousin Barnabas were going to the mission field, and they took with them John Mark. They got to the place where they were about to leave the Eastern world and enter into the world of the West. You know, the West, where those Westerners live. You know, Greeks, Romans, Gauls, Celts, those people. And John Mark said, you know, I just remembered I have something very pressing to do back in Jerusalem. And he got on a boat and went back the other way. And Saul of Tarsus, whom we know as the Apostle Paul, he was not happy. The next time Barnabas and Paul were planning a mission trip, Barnabas said, hey, John wants to go with us. You mean John Mark? Marcus? Paul said, we're not taking that loser. We tried to take him once and he backed out on us. He's a coward, he's a sissy. I don't have time for cream puffs. Tell him to go home. This is dangerous stuff we do. We get thrown in prison, we get beaten, we get stoned, we get hollered at, we get shouted at, we get thrown out of synagogues. I'm not dealing with some sissy coward boy that wants to run home every time it gets tough. And Barnabas was like, come on, man. You're supposed to be the ambassador of Jesus Christ. And that's the level of your patience and forgiveness? And they got into like a fight about it. They were mad. And it was so sharp, Dr. Luke tells us, that Barnabas said, well, I'm taking John Mark. You want to start your own crew, get somebody else, that's fine. But I'm going to the field and I'm taking John Mark with me. And Paul said, you just do that. And they went their separate ways. That was John Mark. That was Mary's son. Mary's son knew what it was to fail and get back up and go again. It is said of John Mark that as Simon Peter was imprisoned in Rome, and it wasn't like Paul being imprisoned in Rome, okay? See, Paul grew up in Tarsus, and Tarsus is a place that was not a Roman colony. The people there were actually Roman citizens, okay? So Paul was born a Roman, even though he was ethnically a Jew. So when Paul was arrested and taken to Rome and he was sentenced to die, it was not good, but it was not a dungeon. Paul had the ability to have guards posted at his residence, and Paul was wealthy enough to do that. And when it came time for Paul to be killed, they could not legally crucify him because he was a Roman. Simon Peter, on the other hand, crucified upside down by request because he didn't think he was worthy to die like Jesus. Paul, on the other hand, they would have said, we're going to make you a cup of tea. It's called hemlock tea. If you drink it, this will all be over quick. Paul said no. So they chopped off his head. But here's the thing. John Mark was there. And according to early Christian tradition, he was the one who would bring food and water to Simon Peter in the prison. He was the one who would take messages from Simon Peter back to the church members in Rome. He was the one who cared for and sat at the feet of the most famous apostle ever. And it's even said that when John Mark wrote the gospel, he was writing down what Peter had told him because he wasn't there for most of it. John Mark grew up. John Mark grew forward. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever been an irresponsible youth, young person? When you're 60, you'll look back on being 50 and think, man, I was really young and stupid then, right? I'm 51, and I can tell you 50 seems like a really bad year sometimes. It's, or 40, or 30. Don't even talk to me about 20, right? But John Mark had something that allowed him to get back up again. You know what it was? Foundation. And where did he get that spiritual foundation from? From Mary. As a young man, his father died. I've been there. I was about 25 when my dad died. But Mary continued to mentor her son and to prepare him for whatever ministry God might call him to. Mary was the one who gave John Mark his anchor. When he got scared on the mission field and came home, where do you think he went? He went home to Mama. And Mama probably made him something to eat, or had one of the servants do it more likely, sat down over a sandwich, although it hadn't been invented yet, and said, Johnny, what are you doing here? You told me that God called you to go with Uncle Barbie and Paul to go on the mission field. Why are you here before they came back? I couldn't take it. I had to quit. It was too hard, and I got scared. Oh, well, that makes sense. Let me pack your bag, and you can go back. It wasn't quite that easy. Travel in those days wasn't as simple as it is now. You couldn't pull out your phone and book a flight, right? But when they went on the mission field again, John Mark was ready to go. And his life was never the same. He was Mary's son. We learn that her name was Mary. Mary is actually an American English modern way of saying the ancient Hebrew name Miriam. Remember the first Miriam, the first Mary in the Bible? Moses' big sister, right? Yeah. Moses' big sister is the reason Moses knew who he was. Moses' big sister. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was probably named in honor of Miriam, Moses' sister. Mary, the mother of John Mark, probably was too. Her name was Mary. It's interesting because Miriam or Mary is derived from the word Mara in Hebrew. Does anybody remember off the top of your head from your last Hebrew class what Mara means? Probably not, right? Mara means bitterness. Isn't it interesting how much the women named Mary in the Bible suffered bitter experiences? Miriam had that whole living in the wilderness thing. Also, she got leprosy once. And then, by God's grace, she was cured of an incurable disease. Right? Mary, the mother of Jesus, saw her baby boy crucified. Her firstborn. Her son of promise. Mary Magdalene, 7 devils lived inside of her until she met Jesus. Mary of Bethany, for some reason, and we don't know why, she had a bad reputation as a, and I'm quoting here, as a sinner, end quote. You ever met one of those, a sinner? But that was her, she was like, people called her a sinner. Like, when another sinner points their finger at you and says, you're a sinner. You know what I say? Yep, I'm a sinner. I'm a sinner saved by grace. How about you? You want some of that grace? Mary of Bethany had that reputation. Mary, the mother of John Mark, people came to her house looking to arrest people. Now, I don't know if you've ever experienced the cop showing up and arresting somebody. I saw my mom get put in the back of a squad car once. Wasn't the first time she got arrested, was the last time, but it wasn't the first time she got arrested, but it was the first time I saw it, right? The only time I saw it. Mary experienced soldiers showing up at her house looking to take people away. And she saw her son travel the world being persecuted with the men of God. She lost her husband. All she had left was her house and her servants and her baby boy. But when God came calling to ask for her son, there's no evidence that Mary even blinked. Wow. In Acts 12, we find out that her name was Mary. And she was the mother of Jonas in Hebrew. It's the same name that Simon Peter's father had, Jonah. It's interesting. Meaningless, but interesting. There were 2 Johns who wrote Gospels, John Mark and John the Beloved. John Mark was younger even than John the Apostle, who was the youngest of the apostles. Secondly, she and her husband hosted the Last Supper. You remember what we read about in Luke? First day of unleavened bread, time to kill the Passover lamb. Jesus says, go prepare, we're going to eat. He said to them, they said to him, where do you want us to prepare it? When you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house that he enters. And you shall say to the owner of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples? This is the New American Standard Version. The owner of the house, the man of the house is literally what the term means. He will show you a large furnished upper room. Prepare it there. Yeah. They had the last Passover. Think about this. The last Passover of the Old Testament era. A new covenant was going to be testated in the blood of Jesus the following morning. The apostles stayed in her home. We read about that in Acts chapter 13. Acts chapter 1, verse 13. The apostles, 11 grown men who had followed Jesus around, wandering, made a home in Jerusalem in Mary's house. If the upper room was that big, how big do you think the house was? Right? We also found out, in addition to being Mark's mama, she was also Barnabas' sister. Barnabas may have been actually her nephew. We don't know exactly what the relationship was. The term most commonly means cousin, but it can mean niece or nephew. In this case, nephew. Imagine, either way, the influence she might have had on Barnabas. Barnabas is not even his real name. The apostles called him Barnabas. It means son of consolation or comforter. The person who takes care of you when you're down. How many of you have someone like that in your life? If you don't have someone in your life, and I don't mean your spouse, okay? It's not that not all spouses do that, and they should, but someone that you know, if you call them and say, I need you, they are going to be there, other than your spouse. Barnabas' name given to him by the apostles means he was known to be that guy. And not just for one person. How much influence do you think Mark's mama had on Barnabas? Because I see a lot of her in him. Sister's son to Barnabas. So what are the lessons we can learn from this great mom, Mary, who is the mom of John Mark and the sister or maybe aunt to Barnabas? Well, first of all, we can learn great moms bring Jesus into their home. If you had the privilege of growing up in a home where your mama prayed, you are blessed. If you had a privilege of growing up with the same drug problem that I used to have, every Sunday and Wednesday my mama drugged me to church, you are blessed. Okay? If you ever thought, my mama makes me go to church, you should thank God right now that you had such a mama. Because not everybody does. Great moms bring Jesus into their home. Did Mama read the Bible to you? Yeah. Did she teach you to understand Elizabethan English by reading the King James to you? Yeah. I think it's so funny when people say, you know, kids today just can't be expected to read Old English. Like, we teach them Shakespeare in school. Come on. Have you ever heard of Geoffrey Chaucer? They teach that in middle school. Come on. The problem is not that the Bible is hard to understand. It's that people just don't want to read it because then they might actually have to do what it says. It really doesn't matter if you're using the New American Standard, the New King James, the King James Version, or for that matter, if you want to go back to the Wycliffe edition from 1300. The fact is, if you don't read the Bible, it's probably because you just don't want to do what it says. Did your mama tell you this book contains the words of life? Did she teach you to recite the 23rd Psalm, or Psalm 1, or John 3:16? I guarantee if you had a Christian mama, she probably taught you Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1. And ye children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. All right, great moms bring Jesus into their home. Lesson number 2. Great moms do not hesitate to trust God with their children's destiny. When God came calling for little Johnny, Mary didn't get in his way. And John Mark had a great destiny. John Mark became one of the 4 evangelists who gave us the gospel of Jesus Christ. But that was just one assignment he got from God. The time would fail us before the Mother's Day feast got cold or got burned to talk about all the other things that John Mark did. How he went on the mission field with Barnabas and was not only a great helper to a great man of God, but was also a great man of God who preached the word, who was in season, instant, and out of season, instant, ready, prepared to go. Over and over again, after the Apostle Paul had his temper tantrum with John Mark, the Apostle Paul would write to people and say, "Is Mark with you? Send me Mark. I need Mark. I'm here. I'm stuck here. I'm in Rome, and I'm kind of a prisoner right now. But hey, John Mark is here, so we're good." John Mark's diligent, faithful service even turned his naysayers around. He didn't do it with an argument. He didn't ask for vindication. He just showed that he was different. Number 3, great moms surround their family with the men of God and godly people. I don't know how many of you can remember having preachers stay in your house growing up. You know, some out-of-town preacher would come to preach a revival or something, and, you know, either you had a guest room or one of the kids had to give up their room, right? I've been there. I remember sitting at the table or in the living room, trying not to be noticed when it was past my bedtime, listening to the preachers talk and learning. I remember we didn't just go to church. We usually went to somebody's house afterwards. As often as not, it was ours, right? Because we didn't live that far. Later, it was somebody else's. But the church members would gather after church. You know, it was really unusual where I grew up in church at the Olympia Missionary Baptist Church on Boulevard in downtown Olympia, Washington. It's not there anymore, people on YouTube. Look for Sunbreak Missionary Baptist Church on Facebook. That's where they moved to. Anyway, the church I grew up in Olympia, Washington, it was unusual for anyone to leave within half an hour of the church ending, right? We would have morning worship. We would get done sometime between 12 and 1 because, you know, we were listening to the Word of God. We weren't that worried about what time it was. After church, there would be a pot of coffee in the back. After church, we would go outside and play, unless it was raining. And, of course, it's the Pacific Northwest. That was possible, right? Then we would play in the classrooms or in the nursery or, in the auditorium or something. But we would play while our parents sat around being together. Sunday evening, Wednesday night, same thing. Usually we would go out to breakfast before church or lunch after church with church members, or we would have somebody over to the house. Or the kids would we would take turns at each other's houses after church, Sunday afternoon, because, we were all going to be back together Sunday night anyway. Go home with Aaron, go home with Brad, bring them home with me. Just great moms surround their family with the men of God, godly people. Doesn't mean perfect people, right? I have a family member who constantly says, I just feel so disappointed in my pastor. Maybe I'm wrong, but I put pastors on a pedestal. And I said, say that again, but leave out the maybe. If you leave a church every time you're disappointed by your pastor, you're going to be church hopping every 6 weeks for the rest of your life. Okay? But great moms surround their family with the men of God and godly people, and they don't sit around criticizing them. Like the little boy who came to the back of the church one day after the preacher had preached, and he shook his hand and he said, Preacher, I want you to know I have decided to make lots of money so that I can give some of it to you. And he said, well, that's a very fine thing to do. Why would you do that? And the boy said, because my mama says you're the poorest preacher we ever had. Don't be that mom. Don't be that mom, right? One thing I would never have done is gone home and told my parents that preacher got on to me, right? Kids today come home from school and tell their parents they got in trouble, and the parents are threatening to sue the school. When I was a kid, you kept that stuff quiet, right? If I had gone home and said, can you believe preacher got on to me today? My mama would have whipped me on the spot, no questions asked. If preacher had to get on to you, you got one coming. And I'm like, oh, don't you want to hear my side? Nope. Those were the days. How about this one? Number 4. Great moms dedicate their home to God's kingdom. This one's tough because there might be some things that go on in our homes that shouldn't happen in a place that is dedicated to God's kingdom. Right? There might be some cupboards that need to be emptied. There might be some things we shouldn't be watching on TV. Great moms dedicate their home to God's kingdom. Somebody needs a place to stay. They want to come to the meeting at our church. Out-of-town church family. Man, that used to be the thing. I can remember a time when almost nobody ever went to a fellowship meeting at another church and stayed in a hotel. Everybody stayed with other church members. All the church members in the missionary Baptist churches from Oregon, from Grants Pass, Oregon, to Lakewood, Washington, and above, all the families in the churches knew each other. Because we would go around and stay in each other's homes whenever there was a meeting. You don't believe me? Ask the Wrights. They were there. Well, I should say half of the Wrights in the room were there, and a former Wright in the room was there. But great moms dedicate their home to God's kingdom. And lastly, I thought about this as I was thinking about Mary, John Mark's mama. Great moms influence more than their own children. I can only imagine what the relationship between Mary and Barnabas was like. Could you imagine if you had a sister or an aunt like Mary, John Mark's mom? You'd be like, oh man, John, you better not tell your mom. We're going to get in trouble. Right? But how about this? If you get beat up and you're closer to John's house than you are to Barnabas' house, where do you think Barnabas runs? Mary. The apostles got mommed by this woman. Think about that. Imagine Simon Peter comes downstairs and she says, Simon, I know you're heading off to the temple, but you haven't eaten anything. Sit down. Take 2 minutes. I'm going to feed you something. Here's some bread and milk. Just imagine. Sorry, Mary, I have to really get going. You're going to sit down and eat. The apostles got mommed by this woman. She opened her house to Jesus. Wow. But she didn't stop there. Great moms influence more than their own children. Anybody here have bonus moms growing up? Besides me, am I the only one who had bonus moms? My favorite bonus moms were church moms, right? I grew up in an era when, like, any mama in the church would have no problem whooping me, right? Wouldn't even think to ask, just whoop me. And I wouldn't dare tell my mom about it because then I'd get 2 of them, right? Of course, I'd probably get home and find out my mom had already heard about it. But I certainly wasn't going to bring it up. Think of Betty Tipton, my first Sunday school teacher. She's been dead for a long time. She had this Bible with these thumb tabs that she put in for the books. It was a Schofield Reference edition of the King James Bible, sitting on my desk. That Bible that she taught me from a very early age, it's sitting on my desk. I think about Pat Cook, Brad's mom. Some of you might have met her, may know Brad. He's the associate pastor at Sunbreak Missionary Baptist Church, which is what they now call what used to be the Olympia Missionary Baptist Church, my home church. She was my pastor's wife. She was my best friend's mom. And she was my other mom. My aunt, Denise Clements, was there when my life fell apart and told me to come home. Great moms influence more than their own children. Step parents, church parents, bonus parents, they don't get enough love on Mother's Day and Father's Day. Maybe some phone calls would be in order. Because sometimes text messages just aren't the same thing. And so, I leave you with these 5 takeaways, lessons we can learn from the mother of John Mark. 1, great moms bring Jesus into their homes. 2, great moms do not hesitate to trust God with their children's destiny. 3, great moms surround their family with the men of God and godly people. 4, great moms dedicate their home to God's kingdom. And 5, great moms influence more than their own children. Hope you have a fantastic Mother's Day. Moms in the room, happy Mother's Day from Pastor. Moms in the back, happy Mother's Day from Pastor. Also, I hope to see you all Wednesday evening at our home in Warren. Ask anyone in the church for directions. Wednesday evening at 6 o'clock, as we have our Launch Point small group, in which we will discuss what we learned here today, and we'll share our thoughts on these 5 takeaways. But wait, there's more. We will all answer a question, and I don't yet even know what that question is, but Pastor Joe is going to come and tell us what the question is right now. And he's building suspense with that slow walk of his.
I'm here. There I am. I was off for a second, but I'm off most of the time. Anyway, Jesus assures us that he'll go ahead of us and prepare a place for us in his Father's home. Everybody believe that?
Amen.
That leads to the question of the week. Did the way I lived this week show that I believe that? If yes, how did it show it? If no, what happened? Is that short enough for you this week? Well, if it can't be long, it has to at least have multiple parts to it. Can't make it easy.